We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning now. Okay, so we have an apparent serious oxygen leak.
4, 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we've had a problem. He's in a roll and he can't stop it. Performing an evasive maneuver. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. I think we need to do a little more all-weather testing.
Welcome to space.
Hello, listener, and welcome back to Failure to Launch, the space history podcast where we take you through all the mistakes, failures, and explosions that made modern space exploration possible. We are your hosts, Quinn, he, him.
Chris, he, him.
And a sleepy Chris, he, him.
And today we are back to continue our series on Mittelwerk, the concentration camp that churned out Hitler's vengeance weapons. Now, I figure we can just kind of get into this without preamble. I don't think anyone's really in the mood for talking about how we're doing today.
We did that ahead of time. We synced the emotions. We're going into the sludge.
Yeah. Now, because it's been a little while and we did have a kind of palate cleanser episode in between, I do need to give a quick recap on the story so far. So in part 2, we covered the period from 1942 to late 1943. After a few years of scrambling for resources, Wernher von Braun and his team at the Peenemünde Army Research Center managed to secure enough funding and priority that they could move to building and testing A4 missiles, A4 being the fourth iteration of the Aggregat program. And in case anyone is jumping in at this point or doesn't remember from the previous episodes, the A4 is the official name of the V2, the world's first ballistic missile. Their early success brought them unwanted attention, specifically from SS boss Heinrich Himmler. As Hitler became more impressed with the missiles, Himmler pushed harder for the SS to co-opt the program from the army. The SS took over Peenemünde security. They set up a concentration camp to supply slave laborers, and they started training their soldiers into launch units. Meanwhile, work at Peenemünde was noticed by the British, and they organized a massive 600-plane bombing raid called Operation Hydra to try and knock out the German missile program. They failed. The raid did minimal damage, only delayed the V2 by a couple of months, and killed more than 700 innocent slave laborers. In response to the bombing, Himmler rushed out plans to spread out all A4 production into underground factories. The biggest of these was an enlarged salt mine in Nordhausen called Mittelwerk, meaning the Central Works. Central here because this mine would be the end point of a sprawling missile assembly line, where components would be shipped from all across occupied Europe and assembled into superweapons by concentration camp inmates. While the facility also produced V-1 cruise missiles and jet engines for various Nazi aircraft, the bulk of it was dedicated to Wernher von Braun's missiles. This is where we are going to be picking up with part 3. I am going to, again, give a huge content warning up front. We are going to be talking about genocide and a lot of people dying in needlessly cruel ways. We are going to talk about it and be as complete as possible because this is space history and it needs to be remembered as such. We are not going to try and sugarcoat anything. If you don't want to hear this, don't listen. If you do, consider when you're listening. I have no problem with saying that writing this, researching this has ruined my day. And I am generally used to researching this kind of thing. Now, as we're getting more into the story of Mittelwerk itself, I'm going to be shifting our sourcing again a bit. For bigger picture stuff, I am still using the books The Rocket and the Reich by Michel Neufeld and V2, A Combat History by T.D. Dungan, but also accounts by Mittelwerk survivors, like the book Dora by Michel and A Teenager in Hitler's Death Camps by Benny Grunfeld. I also have an additional source that I found while working on this series, A History of the Dora Camp by historian and Dora survivor André Sellier. This one I wanted to bring up and recommend specifically because Sellier was both an inmate at Mittelwerk-Dora and later became an accredited historian. He was a history teacher and member of the French Resistance before, and then he got captured, which got him sent to Dora. His work is unique in what I have found so far because it combines the two kinds of sources we've used. Historical texts like Neufeld's and Dungan's, and first-hand accounts like Michel's and Grunfeld's, and I found that it gave a unique and valuable viewpoint. As always, all links will be down below in the show notes. So yeah, like I think I talked to you guys about this, but this book, Dora, is specifically like I liked it because he Andre Sellier, this author, A History of the Dora Camp, he is very much able to like separate his time, his personal experience there from the pure historical, like not implying that the memoirs of the other survivors are not historical, but it is like there is a very clear writing difference between here is a historical accounting of everything that happened at the camp and all of the different politics of the Nazi inner circles and whatnot. And I don't know, every now and then it's mostly a history book, and then there will just be like a closed brackets of, yeah, the author also experienced this firsthand.
Okay.
Yeah. For what it's worth, he mostly relies on the accounts of other survivors. He does put this at the beginning of the book and kind of say like, you know, I lived this, I experienced this, but this is mostly going to be about other people's experiences. Again, a very good book. It will be down below.
Mm-hmm.
The First Convoys.
Now, as we get into this, I want to take a minute to explain some of the logistics of the Nazi concentration camp system, because it is relevant to our story and what made Mittelwerk and Dora what they were. First is how prisoners were categorized and what that meant for the camps they were interned in. The Nazis, being Nazis, liked to itemize and organize their prisoners. The most obvious part of this was colored armbands. You're probably familiar with the famous yellow armbands worn by Jewish concentration camp prisoners, but the Nazis had basically an entire rainbow of death. Gypsies wore brown bands, homosexuals wore pink, people the Nazis considered asocial wore black, Jehovah's Witnesses wore purple, and crucially for us, criminals wore green and socialists wore red. National identity was another part of this system. Everyone's armband had a letter on it for their home nation. F for France, P for Poland, etc. This impacted who wound up in what color category as well. For example, being gay was illegal in Germany because it was a crime against the Aryan race. So aside from a few exceptions, only Germans wore pink armbands. Citizens living in occupied countries that weren't annexed into the Reich, so like Poland was annexed into Germany formally, but France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, they were just occupied territory.
Ah, gotcha.
And because of that legal distinction, their people did not become green prisoners. They didn't become concentration camp criminals, quote unquote, because they were tried for crimes in courts in their home countries. If a French person murdered someone, they went to French court. These two factors, the armband color and nationality of prisoners, had a huge impact on life at different camps because parts of camp administration were handled by prisoners. Capos, prisoners who worked with the SS to supervise other inmates, were by and large drawn from German Greens. That is, criminals who already spoke German. And, you know, I kind of want to make a distinction on this early that I am not like... There's kind of the, like, historically different groups treated other groups of prisoners better than others, but I am not, like, everyone here, I am trying to be clear, is a concentration camp inmate. And that is also not to entirely trust what the Nazis considered to be quote-unquote criminals. But in 1943, the Buchenwald camp in Germany saw a large influx of red prisoners, that is, people wearing red armbands or socialists, specifically evacuated from camps in Ukraine to stay ahead of the advancing Red Army. This rapid influx saw the Greens become a minority of the prisoner population, and the Reds take over camp administration, which markedly improved conditions. Like, different camps wind up with different like demographics of prisoners at them, both national and what they are interned for, and that does have a very large impact on conditions at these camps. It doesn't make any of them good. It doesn't make any of them even like approaching livable, but it is factors that improve the survivability of prisoners at these camps. In A History of the Dora Camp, Andre Sellier quotes Holocaust scholar and Dachau survivor Hermann Longbeen as saying, quote, in 2 chapters of his work, La résistance dans les camps de concentration nationaux socialistes, which means the resistance in the camps of the National Socialists, he successfully examined the prisoners' autonomous administration, and the struggle between the Reds and the Greens. He insists on the need to avoid an excessively black and white view of events in seeing evil on the side of the Greens and good on the side of the Reds. He nonetheless concludes that overall, the Reds were by far and away preferable to the Greens, both in the case of communist control as at Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen, or social democratic and Catholic control as in Dachau. The omnipresence of Greens at Dora, in the difficult periods, on the other hand, has tragic consequences. So I guess even in terms of a bit of a spoiler, what we're going to be talking about is how, in large part because of these different armbands and who winds up in charge, Mittelwerk-Dora gets the shittiest end of that deal. Yeah. And again, agreeing with that quote in the sense that everyone here is in a concentration camp. This is not like the Greens were not universally like toadies to the SS.
Gotcha.
Now, this all ties in for us as the first convoys of prisoners in late 1943 were sent from Buchenwald to Dora. These first inmates, whose first jobs was to build the death camp in which they'd be imprisoned, were overwhelmingly Red, non-Germans, young, and new to the concentration camp system. They were captured members of the French resistance. They were Soviet POWs, Czechs and Poles transferred from Auschwitz. Notably, when Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, the Nazis occupied Rome, arrested thousands of Italian soldiers, and took over internment camps full of Yugoslav prisoners. Both groups were then shipped to Dora wearing red armbands. So like the Nazis take over these Italian prison camps, and both the prisoners and the soldiers at them wind up at Buchenwald, wearing comrades now, wearing the exact same armbands and declared socialists by the Nazis. Or I should also clarify, Red was not always specifically socialist, it was also like political prisoner. So, for example, like French resistance members got red armbands, even though they were probably not like communist. In the same way that like any Soviet POW was just assumed to be a Soviet, like a communist by default. In order to administer these new prisoners, the Nazis transferred a large contingent of German-speaking Green Kapos from Buchenwald. And crucially, this means that like the Greens, the Kapos, the people who are directly administering the prisoners, the other prisoners, they speak German. They can converse with the SS, and they crucially have had more time to live and survive at Buchenwald. The other people, like the raw prison labor being sent to Dora, they are people who they are Soviet soldiers who got captured in the last few months. They are Italian and Yugoslav, fighters that get captured, that literally get captured in the same, Italy surrenders in 1943, in September of 1943, and then within a couple of weeks, those soldiers are at Mittelwerk digging.
Oh, Christ.
Everyone aside, generally everyone aside from the Greens, the Kapos, are within a couple of months of being captured. Now, like we talked about in part 2, the construction of Mittelwerk was already approved when the British bombed Peenemünde in Operation Hydra. The Nazis had planned for months to try and atomize their military production, spreading it out into smaller workshops instead of one huge factory, so that if any part was hit by Allied bombers, it wouldn't cripple the entire production line. Or in this case, moving it underground to make it completely bomb-proof. What Operation Hydra did was massively accelerate the Nazis' timelines for moving missile production out of Peenemünde. Just 10 days after Peenemünde was bombed, the first convoys of prisoners, mostly Soviet POWs, reached Konstein, a large hill in Thuringia in central Germany. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing those. Their first job was to expand the salt mines already dug into the hill, per the designs of Hans Kammler, the civil engineer assigned by the SS to head up Mittelwerk. We talked about this guy in part 2 briefly. This is the man who designed Auschwitz and other concentration camps. He is the man who just a few months prior razed Warsaw in retaliation for the Warsaw Uprising. He is probably history's most evil civil engineer. For Mittelwerk, the plan looked a lot like a ladder. Imagine 2 parallel tunnels running from one side of the hill to the other, and there are about 40 smaller tunnels linking them like the rungs of a ladder. Each of these small tunnels was a workshop assigned to a different part of assembling the missile, and an A4 would travel all the way down the long tunnel, getting more complete at every stop. So if you guys scroll all the way down to the bottom of this script, I have a couple of pictures, And specifically, the lowest one is a map of Mittelwerk. So you can see there the kind of ladder design and all of these workshops being in between the two long tunnels.
Okay.
Of particular note on these, the most famous and the one that we are going to talk about later is Hall 41. That is V2 Final Assembly. It is the deepest room. It has the highest ceiling. It is big enough that you can have a full crane gantry and V2s standing upright, which the other workshops don't have. Most of them are relatively small, relatively cramped tunnels.
Mm-hmm.
The work of building the factory was top priority, to the point that no attempt at providing shelters for the prisoners was made until Mittelwerk was up and running. For the first several months, prisoners worked, slept, and died in the dark under Konstein. Quote, "It was only in January 1944 that the prisoners of the commandos working on the outside began to be housed outside the tunnel. The others remained there until April or May. The last to come out in May were the electricians of the Commando AEG. Their underground stay lasted 9 months. And this is also prisoners are dying by droves in these tunnels in the dark. This being a concentration camp, it feels a little superfluous to say that conditions for prisoners were horrible, but it is still worth explaining. As big as the tunnels were, they had become home to more than 16,000 inmates. They were impossibly cramped. Prisoners slept in colossal multi-story bunks, and hygiene was non-existent. Disease ran rampant through the tunnels, and anyone who sickened was either killed on the spot or shipped back to Buchenwald or other death camps to die there. There's a prisoner saying that actually held true for the first few months of Mittelwerk's life, that the only thing Mittelwerk produces is corpses. Anyone who died at Dora, at Mittelwerk, was loaded onto a truck and shipped back to Buchenwald to the crematoria. Worse, Mittelwerk was an active construction site. Prisoners worked in 12-hour shifts, but during their off time, they were still in the tunnels. They were still breathing the same air where mining and blasting was going on 24/7. The air is choked with dust. Everyone's basically choking all the time on debris. Accidents killed workers every day, and any failures were punished with death by SS guards. This is another one where I'm going to get us to scroll down. There is a woodcut just above the Mittelwerk map. This was made by one prisoner. This is what the dormitories in the tunnels looked like.
Jesus Christ, that's what, 4 levels?
Yes. So
it's like an industrial chicken coop for people.
Basically, yeah. So listener, you will be able to find this picture either on YouTube or it will be linked in the episode description. Basically, the way the dormitories worked, where they weren't specific dedicated tunnels. Basically, as tunnels were built, as these workshops connecting the two long tunnels were built, they would gradually be filled in with V2 equipment as it came from Peenemünde, which meant that if equipment hadn't been sent yet, there were empty tunnels, so the prisoners were basically just kept in whatever tunnel was empty. It was still incredibly cramped, and they were sleeping in giant 4-story communal bunk beds, basically, that went all the way up to the ceiling of these small, these workshops. Relating to this, I want to take a minute to describe some prisoner accounts of entering Mittelwerk for the first time. A lot of them describe it as descending into hell. The huge wooden door which barred the entrance cracked shut behind us. We were suddenly engulfed in darkness. Now and again, however, an acetylene lamp threw its sooty glow on the very high walls. We climbed over piles of sand, catching our feet in cables, bumping into beams or railway ties which were scattered over the floor.
We went into the tunnel, walked for a long while. Then on the right, we entered an excavation that had been dug out to establish a temporary abandoned hall. The ground was rough, water seeped from the rocks. Pools of water lay stagnant. Water seeped from everywhere. The ground was sticky and slimy, causing our wooden soles to slip.
In the tunnels where we suddenly found ourselves, there were heaps of stones piled in stagnant water.
So this is to kind of this place is permanently dark. It is humid. It is wet. There is moss on everything. And these people are crammed in like a cattle car. This is, and all the while as these new prisoners are being sent in, there's constant 24/7, 12-hour shifts of just blasting. The air is humid, it's hot, it stinks. Hygiene is nothing. The only latrines, there aren't even provisions for latrines. The prisoners have to make their own. They cut oil drums in half, put a couple of like 2x4s over the top, and that's a toilet. Every prisoner there is aware of the risk of disease, and they are all doing what they can to like try and not go outside, because that's going to, like, they're going to catch a cold. And if you catch a cold, you die. Not drink, like, make sure that their food is as clean as possible, because if you eat dirty food or like drink dirty water, you're going to get dysentery and you're going to die. Rations were also bare bones. There was no fresh water in the tunnels. There were pipes and faucets, sure, but they were filled with dirty water from mixing concrete. Anyone who drank from them very much risked dysentery, the illness that prisoners feared the most. All hydration came from the daily soup, a small bowl of rutabaga broth. Prisoners also got a slice of bread, some margarine, and either a bit of jam or some sausage. Everything except the bread had to be eaten right away. Some also ate their bread too, some stashed it for later. I know this sounds like a tiny distinction, but I wanted to bring it up specifically for this, where a French prisoner described this decision, this conundrum, this way. The torture wasn't worth it, in my opinion. In my 2 years of experience, nibblers were a species that rarely lasted long. This is also another point where the nationalities of prisoners start to become important. With everyone just trying to survive another day, people formed groups and they found different ways of either supporting each other or, unfortunately, preying on each other. The Czech dormitory, for example, made a show of solidarity, protecting their food from any thieves and making sure it was properly distributed and not hoarded. They even, theirs was interesting because they scavenged a lot of wood and they set up, like, a wooden, like a lemonade stand, basically. And if you were in the Czech dormitory, you lined up at the lemonade stand, you gave them your prisoner number, they checked you off on a list, and that was your food and you got it. They had, like, guards assigned at the dormitory, like, at the entrances and whatnot, but that was not universally true. And there was a lot of, like, national, not rivalry, but loyalty, I'll say. For example, when Italian POWs were attacked while pushing a cart of rutabagas to the kitchen, they were attacked by German prisoners. The German capos, the Greens, didn't step in. They allowed the theft by the Germans. And the most prolific thieves of all were gangs of Ukrainian teenagers, mostly Red Army POWs, who would swipe food, good clothes, boots, or care packages for prisoners that would then quickly make their way onto a makeshift black market in the tunnels. So really, like, I don't want to draw a one-to-one line on this, but especially the thing where German prisoners are allowed to, and there's not capo punishment for German prisoners stealing from Italians, for example. That, like, this is what is partially talked about with the Greens being in charge in Dora, in Mittelwerk, has consequences that you would not see at other camps, at Buchenwald with communist control, or Dachau with Catholic control. It is harder to survive in this environment because all these prisoner groups are, like, preying on each other in order to get food, in order to survive. Per Hans Kammler's plans, the total focus of all prisoners was on constructing the factory first. And true to expectations of a rush job being put together by various Nazi factions that all hated each other, on a planning side, it was a complete mess. I know I've been reading a lot of quotes, but I wanted to get this one. This is a bit of a long one just to emphasize the kind of work the prisoners had to do by hand and to show how unorganized the Nazi, like the overhead effort was at Mittelwerk. This is from a Czech survivor, quote, "In Tunnel B, where the assembly cradles had to be movable along the line, the prisoners put in rails. Under the supervision of 5 engineers, the rails were laid on a thick layer of reinforced concrete. Scarcely had the concrete really hardened in our sector of the tunnel that a 6th engineer arrived and ordered that the rails be taken up and moved 2.5 feet to the left. This was very hard work because we had a lot of difficulty breaking a 1.5 mile long 6-inch layer of reinforced concrete with chisels and hammers. What, at the time, we found very funny was that while we were in the south sector starting to rip up the rails, still other prisoners in the north sector continued to methodically lay concrete, carrying their job through to the end. Finally, the rails were moved 30 inches to the left. Assembly cradles arrived for the Wiener Neustadt, but they are turned out to be too heavy and impractical. So we waited for other assemblies from Peenemünde. These cars arrived, but they were for narrow gauge track. So this is just, it's kind of like it's a shambles. Like on the planning side, on the engineering side, it's a fucking shambles. The Nazis have not prepped this well. Kammler has not prepped this well. Everything is cut 5 times, measure never. For Kammler, though, this was all well and good. It got him results. Assembly of the first missile at Mittelwerk started in December, and by January they had entered, they were ramping into mass production. Mittelwerk was finally up and running, and it cost thousands of lives to get to that point.
Central Works Limited.
Now, about a month after Operation Hydra, the German army finally and formally lost control of the A4 program. Hitler had blessed the new missiles and bet an absurd amount of Germany's dwindling resources on this superweapon. Inner circle Nazis like SS boss Heinrich Himmler had taken notice and made sure to also get a slice of the pie. And because this is Nazi Germany, that meant privatizing the new death camp and setting up Mittelwerk GmbH, which is basically German for LLC.
What the?
The English translation for this is Central Works Limited. That is the new name of the private company of the Mittelwerk death camp. And another thing that doesn't get reported as much, or that should be, is that the Nazis absolutely loved privatizing critical military infrastructure and just turning it over to some Nazi bureaucrat to run. Nazi munitions minister Albert Speer presided over a meeting on September 21st to organize this new company, formally laying out how different companies would send it supplies, how the SS would handle security, and how Peenemünde would ship as much of its manufacturing hardware south as quickly as possible. Keeping with the plan to spread rocket manufacturing out to try and bomber-proof it, Mittelwerk would be the central hub of a huge network of factories and workshops. Few parts were actually manufactured there. Its main job was assembly. The inputs were completed rocket components and prisoners. The outputs, A4s and corpses. One part of the A4 program that did not move from Peenemünde was the development unit under Werner von Braun. There was a plan to move them to an underground bunker, but construction was delayed, and von Braun used that excuse to stay in his beloved Peenemünde. People will often post pictures or talk about how Operation Hydra was so successful while looking at the damage, but one of the things that the Germans did at Peenemünde was deliberately fuck it up more to make it look like it had been completely knocked out. They added fake roofs above buildings so that when viewed from above, they looked completely blasted out, but there was still just a full-on V2 factory underneath. A4 testing, however, was moved out of Peenemünde. It was moved to Blizna in Poland. And if you remember that name, it's because we did talk about it way back when in our episode on the Polish resistance on Operation Third Bridge, because Blizna was the launch site for these rockets, and then their target site, the Polish resistance, was able to effectively just jack an entire landed V2 from it. Quote, "The schema decided on was as follows. The rocket would be designed in the development unit, which remained at Peenemünde, until its planned transfer to Ebensee. It would be assembled by Mittelwerk in the Dora tunnel and sent from there to Blizna for a test flight. No small journey. This plan, however, took time to set up. Between August 1943 and January 1944, as equipment was shipped south from Peenemünde and slave workers carved Mittelwerk out of a mountain, no new A4s were produced. The only ones left were 8 in storage at Peenemünde. And testing those last few rockets revealed that the A4 still had major problems, often landing entire kilometers off target or just failing in flight. It also had a very bad tendency to explode just a few seconds before impact, airbursting high enough to do practically no damage to targets on the ground. We'll talk about it more in part 4, but there is actually a fun story where Dornberger and von Braun nearly get killed at Blizna, where basically they are being sent to investigate that airbursting problem, so they go to the target site, and they want to investigate, basically they want to do forensics on the wreckage that is found at the target site to try and figure out, did this get wrecked in the explosion, or did it fail before the explosion, stuff like that. So they go to the target site, and it is only then that Werner von Braun checks his watch and notices, there's a test launch scheduled for, right the fuck now.
If only.
I know. And they again, this rocket lands successfully. it lands off target. It lands within 90 meters of the observation post that Dornberger and von Braun are at. Which, like, again, if only. Also just loving the idea of, like, I'm going to stand right at the center of this bullseye, and I'm going to take a look around. They also figured that being close up, like actually observing the landing, like the explosion, could like give them some info on what happened, if it was like tumbling or spinning or whatever. Now, for our original cast of characters that we started with, like Dornberger and all the scientists, these problems are a disaster. The missile program was delayed by months. Operation Hydra had knocked out, like, forcing, whether or not it actually knocked out the V2 program, Hydra did force the Nazis to, like, spread it out, and that did delay it by a couple of months. Testing that used to happen all on site was now spread out over hundreds of kilometers, so these rockets are getting, like, shipped by train across entire countries. The program was rapidly being co-opted by the SS, and Walter Dornberger quickly lost his job planning out the application and use of the A4, and he was replaced by General Erich Heinemann. As far as I can tell, no relation to the Mythbusters guy.
Mm-hmm.
Dornberger was relegated to training new recruits that would eventually form operational V2 launch crews. Worst of all, the Allies were finally taking the missile threat seriously. In the months after Operation Hydra, more than half of all Allied reconnaissance flights, US and British, in occupied Europe were being sent to identify missile infrastructure, both V1 and V2. Once found, those sites could expect day and night bombings round the clock, since the US 8th Air Force had now joined the fight. For those who don't know, in World War II, the British preferred night bombing raids, while the US, once they entered and flew out of the UK, preferred day bombing. So, like, German targets would get bombed all through the day by Americans, and as soon as it flips over to night, the British show up. Their first target was the massive Witten bunker at Depelec, France. Over the course of a single week, 3 American bomber raids flattened the site, damaging it so much that the Germans abandoned using it as a V2 launch site, though they'd still try and finish parts of the facility. As with Hydra, hundreds of slave laborers were killed in this raid. Back at Blizna, the new V2 rockets were still being put through their paces in preparation for operational use. At the same time, their launch crews were perfecting how soldiers in the field would use these new superweapons. Like, ballistic missile training was not a thing. These guys were basically just kind of trying shit and writing down whatever worked. After the discovery and bombings of the V2 bunkers and V1 launch rails in France, it was decided that the V2 would go back to mobile launch batteries that could shoot and scoot before Allied planes caught them. However, these new strategies weren't always sound. During one test launch at Blizna, a soldier forgot to cant the launch cradle in the right direction. The rocket flew wildly off course and crashed. Normally, this would just be another failed launch. The V2 had plenty of them. But General Heinemann was present, and using his zero experience with rockets, he decided that the problem hadn't been the launch table, it had been that they had launched the rocket on soft ground instead of concrete. Despite being 100% wrong, and being told multiple times that he was wrong, he ordered that all future V2 launches, test or operational, had to be conducted from big, pre-prepared concrete pads. While a lot of the ground crews in actual operational use just ignored this and launched wherever, the ones that did, this meant that suddenly the whole benefit of the V2, which is that it's very easy to quickly set up, fire, and then leave, shoot and scoot. Now the Allies suddenly notice hey, there's a huge circular concrete pad. What's that for?
It's almost like the guys controlled opposition in a way. Just no. You have to launch them from big, noticeable pads.
We're gonna paint concentric red rings around them so you know exactly where to set up.
And a swastika in the middle so you know where to drop the bombs. I mean, launch the rockets.
Yeah, full fucking Fracture font. V2 goes here, big arrow. When these were actually used, this order made V2 launchers way more predictable since they could only launch from certain spots and not just any field anywhere. Local resistance fighters, especially in the Netherlands, mapped out as many of these sites as they could find, reported them to the Allies, and when the Germans launched, they were often sitting ducks for fighters that just strafed the fuck out of them. This is again something we're going to cover in part 4, but I want to sprinkle in some fun stuff. in between all of the fucking Dora misery. The first attempted operational use of the V2 goes horribly because they just get attacked and mauled by a random Belgian resistance cell. A bunch of dudes with just like fucking Liberator pistols just walk up and like murder 4 officers.
I just heard Belgian, not Belgian cell. Just one dude walked onto the site looking like just the Doomslayer.
Well, the funny thing is that it wasn't like a pre-planned operation. So the V2 crew, where they were supposed to launch from, they took a wrong turn. So they wound up like a kilometer from the front line, setting up their rocket. And in front, like in the, basically like where the front line is, the Americans and the Germans are fighting it out. But like in an entire area behind that front line, Belgian resistance cells are like active. You know, like they've been doing resistance stuff, but once the Allies are like right at your town, it's go time. You grab your gun and you start shooting. And like as this is happening, the V2 crew is just kind of like setting up their highly flammable fuel, and random Belgian civilians just walk up and cap them.
Hell yeah. You want to talk about a bright spot? There it is.
Yeah. We'll be going over more of that in part 4, but I still just wanted to bring that up as like a real example of how, at least at first, the V2 crews do not have their shit together. Also because like any operational V2s are happening after D-Day, they are constantly playing keep away with like Canadian, US, and UK soldiers hunting them down. Also worth mentioning that you can still find a lot of these V2 concrete pads. I've been to The Hague and seen more than a few. You can just walk through a forest and find like a big circular concrete, just space.
Dora.
Now, once the Mittelwerk factory was officially up and running in January 1944, work slowly started on a new external camp. It's worth pointing out that of the tens of thousands of prisoners who worked, lived, and died in Mittelwerk, a minority were actually working on missiles, or later jet engines or V1s. These were so-called specialists, electricians, mechanics, machinists, anyone who fell into the concentration camp dragnet but had what Kammler considered valuable skills. The rest, the prisoners considered unskilled, mostly Soviet POWs, they formed the so-called transport columns. They were initially they were the raw labor. They were the guys who had carved out the tunnels and workshops, they had breathed the dust, they had done the blasting. And once the factory was done, once the tunnels were completed, their job became hauling rockets around the factory. They were pushing rail carts with ballistic missiles on them by hand. They were also viewed as completely replaceable, and this attitude and their work meant that the death rate among the transport columns was substantially higher than among the specialists. This one, I don't want to devalue it, but it just like, this seems like the weirdest thing to link it to, but it just seemed like the most fucking like 40K thing to me in my head of like these hyper advanced super weapons being pushed around by literal emaciated slave laborers. You know, like the V2, the A4 at the time is probably the most advanced. I don't know, like maybe the Manhattan Project is up there, but this is like top 5 most advanced things ever created by humanity. And it is being mass produced by dudes who are dropping dead and surviving on like basically rutabaga flavored water. Yeah. Again, all of this added up to make their casualty rate far, far higher than the specialists, and many reported being desperate to get assigned to the rocket workshops just to get out of the construction commandos. So again, yeah, like, so in January 1944, full scale, like not full scale, but mass production of A4 missiles, they're still A4s at this point, starts in Mittelwerk. And because of that, as every new workshop is finished, basically it's kind of like a sequential thing. So a new workshop is finished, it's filled with V2 hardware. Those people who used to live in that dormitory, they get a barracks and they go outside. At the same time, as Dora is built up barracks by barracks, new workshops are being emptied out, the old dormitories, and these are slowly handed over to the Luftwaffe. Because Mittelwerk does not just produce V2s, it also produces V1 cruise missiles, and later on it produces Juno jet engines. Quote, chillingly accurate SS records show that during a period of 7 months, from the end of August 1943 to the beginning of April 1944, more than 17,000 detainees were shipped to Dora. However, the number of prisoners counted by the SS at the beginning of April was under 12,000. Thousands of persons had already perished in the tunnels and were incinerated in the ovens at Buchenwald. This number is also an undercount, because starting in January 1944, Dora developed its own network of sub-camps dotted all around the Nordhausen region. So Dora is formally a sub-camp of Buchenwald. It doesn't have all of its own infrastructure. Like, a lot of the reason why deaths aren't counted at Dora is because anyone who gets sick, they are shipped off to Buchenwald or they are shipped off to Dachau and they die there. And that also means that, like, Dora doesn't have a morgue. Dora doesn't have a crematorium. Any corpses that it has, it ships them down the road. And again, yeah, Dora then develops its own little kind of hive of sub-camps. Some of these were prisoners assigned to work in local factories. Around 20 German companies were involved in Central Works Limited, including Siemens, AEG, Telefunken, Rheinmetall, Ruhrstahl, BMW, Junkers, Heinkel, Walter, Ascania AG, and DMAG.
Don't ask these companies what they were doing in 1944.
No.
Much less IBM.
I just told you what they're doing in 1944. Other prisoners were sent to smaller satellite camps. So we talked about parts of these in part 2. Some of these can literally just be like a one-room workshop. You can have a concentration camp that is 5 guys sitting at a table in one corner of a room and 5 guys sleeping in the other corner of a room, and they just like rotate. Again, nothing at Central Works Limited is being produced at Central Works Limited. They are the Central Works. They assemble. So all of these different factories, all of these different workshops are actually building and like machining the parts. Laura, for example, they gave it a cute little name to go with Dora. Laura was the name of a quarry that prisoners were forced to refit into an oxygen production plant, liquid oxygen, oxidizer for rocket fuel. Other quarries were turned into static test launch sites. And in all of these cases, you're working with cryogens, you're working with rocket fuel, you're working with rockets. The accident rate is brutal. People are burned alive, people are frozen. And in any of these cases, any prisoner who gets hurt, it is a death sentence. There is no medical, there is practically no medical treatment. Unless you are one of the highly valuable specialists, you get nothing. You get death. And even then, the specialists, they are not treated well. The other thing leading to this undercounted death toll is, again, that anyone deemed too sick to work, they were sent off to other camps, either death camps or other work camps. One transport of sick prisoners bound for Majdanek that left on January 6th, 1944, had 0 survivors out of 250.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jesus fucking Christ.
This is, I've got a sad section that'll also make you kind of fuck yeah. Sabotage was also endemic at Mittelwerk. On top of the quality programs with making literal slaves build your rockets in a dark cave, many prisoners deliberately built the rockets poorly. This is one major reason that rockets coming out of Mittelwerk were of noticeably worse quality and much more prone to failure than earlier Peenemünde-made prototypes. When this trend was noticed, it kicked off a kind of brutal quality control arms race between the prisoners and the guards. Prisoners were required to mark off parts they'd worked on with their ID numbers, so that way if a part failed inspection, the perpetrator could be found and punished. In return, the prisoners found more refined ways of wrecking the rockets, inventing techniques that could pass a quality inspection, but still fail after launch. Electricians deliberately made cold solder connections that they knew would fail. Welders hid bad welds inside of the rocket and then covered them up with panels that they welded properly. So if you're looking at a rocket from the outside, it looks fine, but once you're past the skin, everything is badly arc welded together so that it will break under the slightest pressure.
Good. Fuck them.
Yeah. Bad parts from other Mittelwerk subcamps or contractors from factories were accepted even though they were clearly out of spec and would fail. I'll remind everyone here that most of the prisoners working on the actual rockets, the specialist corps, these were people who had technical skills and a lot of them had flat-out experience fighting the Nazis. These were French resistance fighters and Soviet POWs who were hand-picked out of the concentration camp network because of pre-war hardware experience. They were electricians, they were machinists, they knew how to fuck up a build. And a lot of them died doing it. The punishment for sabotage or even poor work was always death. Quote, "The SS guards often carried out individual or group hangings in the tunnels as a warning to the prisoners. The huge cranes in Hall 41 were used to hoist victims up by their necks and let them slowly strangle in full view of the workers of each shift, who were specially called to witness these hangings. The dead were then left hanging there, about 4 feet off the floor for a day or so while the prisoners came and went beneath.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and specifically, a lot of prisoners, Jean-Michel especially, I think I said 4 feet. It says 5 feet in the quote, sorry. This is picked so that as people are going back and forth, they're not...
So that you'll have to move them
so that
up.
their feet bump your fucking head as you're walking around.
Jeez. I know I
These
said it a
guys
lot,
suck, dude.
but Jesus fucking Christ.
This is also something that we know Von Braun witnessed. Later on, he'll try and say like, "Oh, I never went there. I didn't know what was happening." Like, we know for a fact from Jean-Michel and multiple other survivors, Werner von Braun witnessed these hangings. There are some sources that say, like, there's a couple of accounts that say that he ordered them. We don't know that for sure, but we do know that at the very least he was there and witnessed a group execution of saboteurs.
Can we have, like, I know there's such a thing as a corpse synod. Can we have that, but just dangle his corpse outside of a public area? I don't care how macabre it is. No, fuck him. Fuck everything.
A couple of people do die later on during the Mittelwerk trials. They should have been dangled in Hall 41.
They should have been hung in the fucking place of their crimes.
I want to put every single person that was complicit with the creation of this in, like, the infinite explosion chamber.
Yeah, and
to
if
be
you scroll...
exploded and rewound and unexploded and re-exploded for eternity.
I want the most malicious Mickey 17 possible.
Oh, and if you scroll down to the bottom of this script, you can find a picture of Hall 41 to kind of give you an idea of what, like, again, Hall 41 is the final assembly area. It is a huge 50-foot tall chamber in which these huge cranes are coming down from the ceiling. V2s are being moved vertically, like they are fully stood up at this point. This is a huge chamber. People are bustling back and forth. It is big enough that they are able to perform these huge staged mass executions to try and intimidate the prisoners.
I'm getting mad.
Now,
I'd rather be mad than sad, and we're getting that.
This is where I am going to cap off part 3. I know this is kind of a weird place, like, storyline-wise to cap this off, but because at the start of the next part, a whole lot of weird Nazi political stuff happens all at once, and it'll be important to cover in detail because it all flows downhill to Mittelwerk, and it makes life significantly worse for the prisoners there, as shitty and horrific as it already is.
Like, instead of breaking up what's happening there, just keep it whole cloth so that it can be just pushed, just to push through it at once.
Yeah, and I know I talked to you guys before in saying that, like, you know, I think I've said in some earlier parts, I want this to be pure focus on Mittelwerk. We're going to talk about the V2 as a weapon later. In researching this, that kind of doesn't work.
We got mission creep because there's so much that affects it.
Yes, yeah, especially because, again, I highly recommend people read these books going into the conditions and what happened at Mittelwerk. They will all be linked down below. It is difficult to talk from a historical timelines perspective about what happens at Mittelwerk in the same way that, like, a lot of the stuff in the concentration camps, there was not as much, like, day-to-day big events or big characters. They were death factories. Life at Mittelwerk was generally the same Monday through Friday, Saturday, Sunday, weeks and months and whatnot. It just produced death. The main drivers of things that, like, changed life at Mittelwerk were happening in the Nazi inner circle. So looking at Mittelwerk without looking at the people in charge of it, like, it creates a lot of a disconnect. And again, I decided to cap off this one. Like, this story, in conclusion, kind of takes us from August 1943 to around April 1944. And I wanted to pick this point to cap it because the start of part 4 is going to be a lot of shit happening all at once. That, like, dramatically changes the condition at Mittelwerk. But to kind of cap off, like, this episode, to give a kind of mission, like a conclusion or final statement to it, like, over the span of about 8 months, the Nazi plan to move A4 missile production underground was fast-tracked. The incredible speed of the plan achieved through a complete and callous disregard for human life. I know we've said it a few times before, but I want to make this clear, especially when, like, Nazi Germany has this vaunted reputation for quality in industry during World War II, that by April 1944, when V2 production was beginning to ramp up significantly, it had first started in December. They were starting to produce them in January. April is when, like, there are continuously V2s. They're doing the Khrushchev thing. They're churning them out like sausages. By the time that happens, more than 6,000 prisoners from France, Ukraine, Russia, Poland, Italy, Czechoslovakia, and Germany had died, either at their posts or shipped off to death camps when they became too sick to work. For the first 4 months of its life, and it lasted a little less than 2 years, Mittelwerk produced nothing but corpses, and from January 1944 on, it produced a weapon so shitty and ineffective that it could only be fired at what was then the world's biggest city.
Honestly, it seems like death was most of the point.
There are a lot of historians that do point that out. There are historians and people who survived Mittelwerk who do say that for the Germans, this was a good thing, because this meant that the V2, they had invented a weapon that could kill undesirables as part of its manufacturing process. That, like, it's something that gets bandied around now a lot, but, like, the cruelty was part of the point. And again, like, the whole point of the vengeance weapon, von Braun knew from the very beginning that this weapon could not be targeted tactically. In history, there was, like, one meaningful attempt to use the V2 as a tactical missile. They were trying to hit a bridge to stop an American advance, and they miss repeatedly. The V2 can only be used against cities. It is so inaccurate that it can only target something as big as London. It's a vengeance weapon. It's a terror weapon. It is something that kills prisoners to be built, and it can only be targeted at civilians. And I know I'm ranting and getting super pissed about this, but, like, this is something that if you're interested in the space industry, if you are interested or working in space, this is something that needs to be known and accounted for. This is, like, the V2, in the same way that the R7 is a horrendously shitty ICBM, the V2 is a very shitty ballistic missile. And it is still the, like, forefather of every modern launch system, missile, rocket, whatever, to have come since. And this series is also going longer than expected, and that's because we made the decision to kind of do it properly and to not trim it for length or to remove particularly bad parts. At the same time, I know this doesn't make particularly happy listening, and it takes over a significant chunk, weeks and months of the show, but we think this deserves to be talked about, learned about, and remembered. I just realized that in that ranting, I made podcasting sound like some kind of noble, like, it doesn't matter. You need to listen to that. Like, I don't know. I'm fucking pissed.
No, it's if you're a space nerd, you need to know that some genesis of it comes from hell.
So yeah, listener, that is part 3 of our series on Mittelwerk. At present pace, I think it's going to be a 5-part series, and I'm job hunting right now, so I do have time to, hopefully we can get these out sooner. We can do weekly for the rest of the Mittelwerk series instead of bi-weekly. But yeah, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Adios.
Thank you to everyone who have signed up to support the show. And a big shout out to all of our top tier patrons. Our cyborg cats are Boss, Katiga Reptile, Charlie, Comrade Sleepy Bro, Daniel F., Graham E., Jesslyn T., Jorg 2, standing in the corner at the insertion party, Kamo, Lane of the Wired, Matt, Mobius Striptease, Murray Motorsports, Mysterious Stranger, Number Negative, Oil Drum, Pat, Paul C., Rare Scrungle Spingus 3rd Edition, Skylab Bricks, Source Force, Spectre Cohen, Tortilla Baron, Vivek D., and Wingsmith. Our space dogs are A Union Thug, A. Blinken, Akiogo, At Guy is Best Guy, Ariel Badger Release, Agent Carter, Alice N., Andrew F., Andrew K., Angie, Angry Old Man, Yada Yada, Anthony C., Atomic Hobbit, Otto Fox, Baron M., Batve, Ben L., Boomzilla, Brian F., Brian L., C., Cantaloupe Was Taken, Chainsaw Snuggling, Chris, Chris K, Cole C, Captain Lag, CSD 2016, Daddy Bongo, Daniel, Des Smiley, Dom K, Double Time, Dr. Shockmaster, Hank, Aaron, Eric J, Fractal Moonlight, Furious Luddite, George B, Grant K, Griffin, former snow shoveler of Burger King, Heiko S, Howl's Moving Pictures by Rush, Ian R, JMM, James A, James C, James H, James T, Jamie K, Jarl Breadmaker, Jerry M, Jedediah D, John C, John Boy D, Jonathan G, Jonathan W, Johntastic 20x6, Juan, Just Morse, Carathago Delinda Est, Kate B, Kate D, Corbin the Dog, Lenswipe, Lorgath, Luke O, McLean C, Mar, Marto, Maritza, Matthew M, Mitchell L, Movement Instrumentality Project, Narrow Ebb, New Name, Nicholas S, Norman W, Northeast Driver, NSFW NSA, Outlook Cove, Panda, Heap, Poop Butt, Randall, RBK, Rato B, Riley, Soldier of Fortune, Scott K, Sean F, Sean H, Sensual Kazoo, Sean P, Sparks, Spirit of Thunder, Swanee, The Best Sean, Thomas M, Tim P, Toasty Ken, Trash Do, Virosh T, Dixon S, Vrisk, Will W, William O, Zachary JB, Zap, Zemo, Zim, and Zombie Dwarf. Albert Count 182. Thank you for listening to another episode of Failure to Launch. If you want to follow us, we are Failure to Launch on Blue Sky and FT Launch Pod on Instagram. We also post our episodes with visual aids at Failure to Launch Podcast on YouTube. FTL intro and outro themes were provided by DJ Danarchy.